The Johnson family was thrilled to move into their new home. It was an old house in a quiet neighborhood, with enough space for their kids to play. The first morning, as they were unloading boxes, they heard a knock on the door. Standing there was a man from next door, smiling widely. He introduced himself as Tom, friendly, maybe a little too friendly. He held out a casserole dish and told them, "Welcome to the neighborhood." It was a nice gesture, and they were glad to know a neighbor already. Over the next week, Tom showed up nearly every day, once with a bag of homegrown tomatoes, another time with flowers from his garden. Every time he came over, he'd linger just a bit too long, standing by the door, watching them as they settled in. At first, they chalked it up to kindness. "Just a friendly neighbor," Mr. Johnson would say. "Small towns are like that." Then Tom's questions started getting strange. "What time do you leave for work?" he asked one afternoon, his tone casual. "Do you keep a spare key outside, just in case?" Mrs. Johnson laughed nervously, brushing it off, but the questions kept coming. Sometimes, he'd stop by late in the evening, saying he'd just been in the neighborhood, or that he thought he saw someone around their house and wanted to check if everything was okay. It was unsettling, but they didn't want to be rude. One night, Mrs. Johnson was home alone. It was late, and the house was quiet. She thought she saw a shadow pass by the window. Her heart pounded as she slowly walked over, peeking through the blinds. Outside, under the streetlight, stood Tom, just watching. She drew the curtains quickly, backing away. The next day, she told her husband, but he shrugged it off. "It's just Tom," he said, trying to make light of it. "He's harmless." But the strange incidents continued. One evening, after a late night out, they returned to find their back door unlocked. They were certain they'd locked it before leaving. Inside, small items seemed slightly out of place. Books on the shelf, a picture frame tilted. Then, in the dim kitchen light, they saw him, Tom, standing in the doorway, smiling. He said he was just checking in. They demanded he leave, and he did, still smiling as he walked out the door. The final straw came a week later. They were cleaning out the basement when Mr. Johnson found something wedged between the wall and a storage box. It was a small notebook, old and slightly worn, with their names written on the cover. Inside, they found notes about them, about their routines. Pages and pages of detailed notes on what time they left in the mornings, when they returned, even what the kids liked to eat. A chill ran through them as they realized just how closely he'd been watching. They reported Tom to the police, who took the notebook as evidence. The very next day, he disappeared, just vanished. No goodbye, no sign. Some say he left town. Others say he's still somewhere in that quiet neighborhood, watching a new family. But one thing's for sure, the Johnsons never felt safe in that house again. When Emily moved into her new apartment, she felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was a fresh start in a small building, perfect for her new job, but from the first night, she sensed something wasn't right. She'd catch glimpses of her next-door neighbor, always lurking in the hallway, watching her. He never said a word, just stood there, eyes fixed on her every time she entered or left her apartment. She tried to ignore it. She told herself he was just strange, maybe lonely, but it didn't stop. One night, as she was coming back from work, she saw him standing at his door, staring at her. She managed a nervous nod and hurried inside, locking her door behind her. But the feeling lingered. As she unpacked her groceries, she swore she heard shuffling sounds, soft footsteps right outside her door. She froze, listening, but the sound faded. Days went by, and the unease grew. It wasn't just the staring. Little things around her apartment started feeling wrong. Her keys were moved. The blinds would be open when she knew she'd closed them. One morning, she found her kitchen cabinets slightly ajar. She was sure she hadn't left them like that. It was subtle, but enough to keep her on edge. She mentioned it to a friend, who laughed and said she was imagining things. But one evening, She came home to find her door unlocked. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped inside, heart pounding. The lights were off, but the living room lamp was on, dimly illuminating the space. She looked around, and that's when she noticed it. Her shoes were arranged differently, her kitchen towels folded neatly on the counter. Someone had been there. Terrified, she ran to a friend's house, not daring to stay another night. The next day, she reported it to the landlord, who promised to look into it, but offered little comfort. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Emily decided to install a small camera in her living room, just in case. A week later, the camera caught him. Her neighbor, creeping into her apartment while she was at work. He'd used a spare key and was wandering through her things, touching her belongings, even standing in her bedroom. She took the footage to the police, who arrested him that night. But the damage was done. Emily moved out the next day, leaving behind the nightmare of her watchful neighbor and her once quiet apartment that never felt like home again. Claire and her boyfriend, Alex, moved into the apartment hoping for a fresh start. The building was old but charming, and their unit was spacious and quiet. At first, they were thrilled, but as the weeks passed, they began hearing strange sounds at night. It started as a faint noise, a distant, muffled scream that seemed to come from the walls. The first time it happened, they froze. It was late, nearly midnight, and they were in bed, drifting off to sleep. The scream was soft, almost like it was part of a dream. They both heard it, but neither said anything, too unsettled to bring it up. The next morning, they shrugged it off, convinced it was a figment of their imagination. But the following night, it happened again. This time, it was clearer, a cry, echoing through the walls, followed by a strange scraping sound. Alex wanted to check it out, but Claire was too scared. It's probably just some noisy neighbors, she reasoned. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. Over the next few nights, the sounds grew louder, more desperate. Not just screams, but low whispers, almost pleading. It got so intense that they began sleeping with the lights on, jumping at every creak and rustle. They even tried to talk to their neighbors, but everyone claimed not to hear anything. The building manager brushed them off, saying no one else had complained. Finally, after a week of sleepless nights, Claire decided to knock on the door of the apartment next to theirs, where the sound seemed to come from. She knocked, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, pressing her ear to the door. She thought she heard something, faint breathing, just on the other side. In desperation, they left a note under the door, asking the neighbor to keep the noise down. That night, the sounds became frantic. The screams turned to wails, pounding on the walls as if someone, or something, was trying to escape. They stayed awake, terrified, clutching each other as the sounds filled the apartment. The next morning, exhausted, they went to the building manager's office. But what they heard chilled them to the core. The manager told them that no one had lived in the neighboring apartment for years. It was an empty unit, boarded up after a tragic incident that left it abandoned. Rumor had it that the previous tenant had gone mad, convinced someone was living in their walls. That night, Claire and Alex packed their bags, leaving the apartment and the building without looking back. But every so often, when they lay in the silence of their new home, they swear they hear faint, desperate cries echoing in the quiet, as if whatever was trapped in that apartment had followed them, forever haunting their nights.